The Cold War. Lecture terms. The origins of the Cold War actually began before World War II is finally over. By the beginning of 1945, it was clear that the Axis powers were going to lose the war, and the Allied powers wanted to make sure that they did not make the same mistakes of the leaders of the West after World War I. They wanted to make sure that they had a plan in place for what would be done once the war was over. And so there were a number of conferences that were held between the Allied powers, that being Great Britain, the United States, and Soviet Russia, or the Soviet Union. The most dominant of these conferences was the Yalta Conference, which took place in February of 1945. Just a few months before the war will end in Europe, and about 6 months or so before it will finally end in Japan. Decisions had to be made on what to do with the defeated powers once the war was over. And in particular, Germany is what concerned the Allies. They did not want a repeat of what happened after World War I, when, of course, Germany will be able to resurge itself under the Nazi leadership. So what are they going to do differently this time in regards to Germany? The decision was made to divide Germany into zones of occupation between the Allied nations. And ultimately, this will lead to a division in Germany between the East and the West. Western Germany, the western half of Germany, will be occupied and looked after by the Western nations, but in particular the United States, as it will come to be. And the eastern half of Germany will be occupied by the Soviet Union. They will also divide the capital city of Berlin. Even though Berlin was located in eastern Germany, that would be the Soviet-occupied side, they will divide the city itself in half between east and west. So western Berlin is actually part of the western Germany, even though it is located, it's surrounded by the eastern half. Now, dividing Germany into zones of occupation, the idea was that there would be a presence, an Allied presence, that would remain in Germany for a number of years to make sure that Germany was not able to move in the wrong direction when it came to its rebuilding process. The Allies wanted to make sure that there was no kind of Adolf Hitler that could come to power once again. Another decision that was made at the Yalta Conference was to create a new international organization that would replace the failed League of Nations, and that would be the United Nations. Now, the United Nations will not actually come to be until October of 1945, after the war is finally over. But discussions were done at the Yalta Conference as to what would make up the United Nations. First of all, it's important to understand that the West, in particular FDR, the American president, wanted to make sure that this international organization was successful. And so they recognized that all of the big power nations must be a part of the United Nations in order for it to work. Not like the League of Nations that had glaring omissions, in particular, the United States. Now, in order to convince Stalin that the Soviet Union needed to be part of the United Nations, they came up with some compromises. First of all, the General Assembly of the United Nations, where every member nation had one vote, the Soviet Union was actually given 3 votes. Stalin insisted upon this, explaining that the Soviet Union was so large and so diverse that they should have 3 votes to balance out the votes of the Western nations that belonged to it. This was something that they were willing to give the Soviet Union because they recognized, the Western Allies recognized, that the Soviet Union's entrance into the war was ultimately important and necessary in order for the Axis powers to be defeated. They most likely would not have been able to defeat Hitler in particular without the help of the Soviet Union. FDR also wanted to make sure that there was a second level of importance, or I guess you would say a higher level of importance within the United Nations as well. And so he insisted upon the creation of the Security Council. The Security Council would have 5 permanent members, and then other members that would be part of the Security Council would be on a rotating basis. But the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which had veto power over any vote that the General Assembly would pass, were the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. FDR felt that if the General Assembly was able to pass an initiative, especially because of the Soviet Union's 3 votes, that the Security Council could have veto power in order to counteract that action. After these decisions were made at the Yalta Conference, more and more discussions happened where we saw differences between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. And these differences will lead to more and more chilly relations and tensions between the different allies. And this ultimately leads to the Cold War. The differences were over the future of Poland, Manchuria, and Eastern Europe. Ultimately, Poland will be occupied by the Soviet Union. By the time we get to February 1945, the Soviet forces had already pushed the Nazis out of Poland, and the Soviet forces were in Poland. They had liberated a number of the concentration camps, and they basically argued that they were not going to leave. They were going to stay there. The Western Allies agreed to allow them to stay there as long as they promised for the eventual creation of free elections in Poland. Now, Stalin agreed to this, but he never intended on keeping this promise, which he did not. And ultimately, Poland would become a satellite state to the Soviet Union. Eastern Europe, the rest of Eastern Europe will also eventually fall under the dominance of the Soviet Union. Communist governments will be brought to power in those areas like Czechoslovakia and Romania and Yugoslavia. These were all areas that between 1946 and 1947 will be dominated by communist governments that ultimately are puppet regimes to the Soviet Union. And this is what will become known as the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. And the Iron Curtain was said to be what separated Western Europe, which was free, from Eastern Europe, which was under the dominance of communist Soviet Union. Now, Manchuria is another issue because, of course, that was a big territory that had been taken over by Japan prior to World War II. And this was an area of China that had a lot of industrially rich resources that could be used for the industrial complexes in many nations, including oil reserves and coal, etc. And this was, of course, something that Stalin wanted for the Soviet Union as well. And he argued that since Manchuria was so close to the Asian parts of the Soviet Union that they already had control over, that the Soviet Union should get control over Manchuria. The Western Allies, Churchill and FDR, agreed to this as long as the Soviet Union promised to declare war on Japan. You see, by February of 1945, the Soviet Union had still not declared war on Japan as part of the Axis powers. Stalin agreed to declare war on Japan But by the time they got around to doing it, the war was about a month away from being over in the Pacific. So there was never really any big impact that left. However, he will be given Manchuria. It looked as if the chilly tensions and the bad feelings between the East and the West, the Eastern allies and the Eastern ally, I should say, and the Western allies, were very clear to what post-war Europe was going to look like, post-war world was going to look like. There was going to be a new kind of reality, and that reality would be the Cold War. After Stalin took over the Eastern European states, creating satellite states to the Soviet Union, the Western allies were concerned that Western Europe could also fall prey to a communist takeover. Remember what we said in an earlier lecture about totalitarianism, whether left-wing or right-wing. Economically depressed nations are more vulnerable to totalitarian takeovers. The United States, in particular, was very concerned that Western Europe, including France, Belgium, Switzerland, and maybe even the UK, could fall prey to a communist takeover because of the economic losses that they suffered during World War II. And so it was very important for the United States, especially since Stalin had taken over so much of Eastern Europe, it was especially important for the United States to maintain democratic governments in Western Europe as their trade partners and allies to counter the growth of communism in Eastern Europe. And so the United States, by the time we get to 1946 and then into 1947 in particular, they developed a new response to the communist threat during this Cold War that they were now entering into. The containment policy is what it will be called. And there are three particular parts of the containment policy that we need to understand. The containment policy itself was the idea that the United States would do whatever was necessary in order to contain communism where it already existed by early 1947. And ultimately, this meant that they would not let communism spread beyond its current borders. That is what containment means. It does not mean to roll back communism where it already existed, but they would draw a line in the sand and basically say, we will not allow it to spread any further, and we will do what is necessary to make sure it doesn't do that. Now, the first part of the containment policy, this is the United States response to the spread of communism. This is the United States action that they will take to make sure that communism doesn't spread. And this diplomatic policy will ultimately dictate what kinds of diplomacy the United States will be involved in from 1947 until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 to 1991, between 1989 and 1991. The first part of the containment policy was actually, the philosophy of the containment policy, and it is encapsulated in the Truman Doctrine of 1947. President Truman, at the time, declared that the world had been divided into free and enslaved states, and the United States was going to have to take the worldwide responsibility to make sure all movements for democracy were supported and would succeed. The Truman Doctrine ultimately commits the United States to interventionist foreign policies in order to contain the spread of communism. This ultimately means that the United States is declaring they will never again be isolationists. They will never again take on the idea of splendid isolationism, where they will not get involved in what's going on in Europe or other parts of the world. Ultimately, the Truman Doctrine will make it so the United States not only becomes a world power, but becomes a world leader. We will make sure we will make the world safe for democracy. And that's what the Truman Doctrine is. So it's the philosophy or the ideology of the containment policy, which will permeate our diplomatic relations for the next 50 years. The second part of the containment policy is the Marshall Plan. It is the economic part, or the economic arm of the containment policy. It is named for the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall. He proposed in 1947, after the containment policy ideology was announced through the Truman Doctrine, that the best way for us to protect our Western allies, to protect the democratic governments in Western Europe, was to make sure that they were not economically vulnerable to a totalitarian takeover. So he proposed in 1947 that the United States invest $13 billion to reconstruct Western Europe, to prop up the economies of the Western European nations, and ultimately by doing so they would be less likely to fall prey to a communist takeover. Ultimately, this would cost the United States a great deal of money, $13 billion in U.S. tax dollars. However, he argued that over time this would pay off and ultimately it would make money for the United States, because by protecting our best trade partners, we guaranteed that we would have trade partners in the future. And ultimately, it did pay off. By investing in Western European nations, the United States was able to ensure that not only we had good trade partners for the future, but also ensure that they would not fall prey to communism. Now, the Soviet Union, under Stalin, will ultimately take a point-counterpoint kind of idea when it comes to the containment policy, especially after the Marshall Plan was announced. The Soviet Union decided that they would counterpoint the Marshall Plan by establishing the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon. This was done in 1949, for the Soviet bloc nations. If you think about this, basically they were saying, the Soviet Union was saying, they would economically maintain the Soviet presence in those Eastern Bloc countries, those Soviet bloc countries. They would make sure that those governments would be propped up by the Soviet Union to maintain their communist governments. The Soviet Union was worried that the United States may try to push their way into these Eastern European nations and try to instigate rebellion against the communist governments that had been established there. So Comecon was the Soviet Union's way to prop up the communist governments in their puppet states, in their satellite states of the Soviet bloc. Ultimately, if you think about it, it was a misunderstanding of the containment policy, because when Truman initiated the Truman Doctrine, he basically said containment means contain communism where it already is, don't allow it to spread further. They weren't going to try to roll back communist influence in Eastern Europe, according to the containment policy. Anyhow, the point is, Stalin is going to draw his own line in the sand with Comecon. The third part of the containment policy is the military alliance that comes out of it. It is the creation of NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was declared in 1949. And ultimately, this was a mutual defense pact created by the United States as well as other northern Atlantic nations in Europe. The United States sponsored this, and basically it would be a collective defense of nations against the communist threat in the Atlantic world. Eventually, NATO expands beyond the Atlantic to include other nations that are not in the North Atlantic. The point behind this was if any of these nations were perhaps invaded by the Soviet Union or another communist threat, the United States was declaring that they would send troops in to defend democracy in those areas. Now, they did not call NATO an alliance. As I said before, they called it a mutual defense pact because after the war was over, they once again tried to outlaw the creation of alliances like they had done after World War I, and we saw how unsuccessful that was. But this really was an alliance if you think about it, even though they want to call it a mutual defense pact. Again, with the point-counterpoint thing going on, the Soviet Union will eventually respond with their own mutual defense pact called the Warsaw Pact, and it will be declared in 1955. This was a countermeasure to the creation of NATO, and it basically had 7 communist European nations, Eastern European nations, belonging to it. And the promise was to not allow any Western influence in those regions, not just economically, which is what Comecon had done, but politically and militarily as well. This is when a great deal of those no-fly zones were established over Eastern Europe throughout the Cold War. Now we need to understand how the containment policy actually was put into action during the Cold War. I mentioned before that Germany was divided into zones of occupation. Originally, it was divided into 4 zones: the British zone, American zone, and French zone, which were all Western and promoted democracy, and of course the Eastern zone, which was the Soviet zone. But eventually the United States came to dominate. They merged their occupation zones and let the Americans police or shepherd the western half of Germany, because the economic problems of Great Britain and France after World War II made it so they could not maintain their military presence there. Ultimately, what will happen to test the will of the United States with their containment policy is the Soviet Union decides to blockade the western half of Berlin, the capital city of Berlin, which was located in the center of Eastern Germany. What happens when they blockade the western half of Berlin was ultimately Stalin and the leadership of the Communist Party were hoping that by blockading it, they could make sure that the citizens of Western Berlin were not able to receive supplies from Western Germany, and ultimately they would be starved into submission, and all of Berlin would be taken over by the Soviet forces in Western Germany. This will lead to an action that the United States takes according to the containment policy. We will put our money where our mouth is with the Berlin airlift. So Stalin was playing a game of chicken to see if the West, in particular the United States, would react when he blockaded Western Berlin. Starting in June of 1948, the blockade was challenged by the West, by the United States, by air shipments being sent into Berlin, dropping supplies into Western Berlin from the air. 11 months of air shipments will be dropped into Berlin beginning in June of 1948. And this ultimately allowed for the citizens of Western Berlin to maintain their democratic principles and their democratic city government, and kept them from falling prey to a communist takeover. Ultimately, this will cause the Soviets to lift the blockade in the summer of 1949. Eastern Berlin ultimately will still be communist, and it will become the capital of what will be known as the German Democratic Republic. It's odd that the eastern half, which is communist, is called the German Democratic Republic, because there's nothing democratic about it. But the capital of West Germany will be located at Bonn, B-O-N-N, in Western Germany, and it will be known as the Federal Republic of Germany. Ultimately, the world referred to the divided parts of Germany as Eastern Germany and Western Germany, knowing that the communist half was Eastern Germany and the free half was Western Germany. Germany will be divided until 1989. After the Berlin airlift was successful in maintaining the western half of Berlin from falling to communism, again, we put our money where our mouth was. This was initiated as part of the containment policy, in particular the Marshall Plan, pouring supplies into our allies' hands. This will cause, eventually, a great number of Eastern Germans to flee to Western Germany to try to escape communism. Between 1949 and 1961, 3.5 million Eastern Germans flee to Western Germany in order to defect from the communist-run Eastern government. So this will cause the Soviet leadership in the 60s to construct a wall between the two halves of the city of Eastern and Western Berlin. The Berlin Wall, separating the East and the West, ultimately will be a physical manifestation of the Cold War. And when it comes down in 1989, it was very symbolic of the crumbling of communism. Just like the wall crumbled, communism will crumble. But of course, that is still a generation away at this point. Now, we call it a Cold War because it ultimately was chilly relations between the Western world and the Soviet-controlled world. And ultimately, there weren't a lot of real flare-ups when it came to military action taking place between the two. Instead, these chilly relations will continue, lots of tension, but very little actual flare-ups or fighting going on, because both were concerned about World War III, ultimately, especially at the end of World War II when atomic power was introduced. And shortly after World War II, the Soviets were able to demonstrate their atomic capabilities as well. Since World War III and Armageddon looked as if it could be a possibility, this will lead to the chilly tensions and the use of tactics that will keep actual fighting from going on. And the containment policy was able to make sure that communism did not spread any further west from where it already was by 1947. The Cold War, however, will start to heat up, and there will be hot spots where there's actual fighting, military conflict going on, as we looked to Asia and Cuba. These will become the new battlegrounds between freedom and communism, or democracy and communism. Now, we were discussing prior to World War II what was going on in the post-World War I world of China. And we discussed how there was ultimately there would be some civil strife between the communists and the nationalists in China that will kind of be put on hold when World War II begins. Japan will overrun China, huge chunks of China, during the war. After the defeat of Japan, civil war once again will erupt between the communists in China and the nationalists. But the communist influence has grown during World War II because, as I mentioned before, after the Long March, Mao and his followers will start to really articulate and develop their communist philosophy. And ultimately, they will use their opposition to Japanese occupation in China as a vehicle to get more Chinese support for their initiatives. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek were forced to retreat after Japan was defeated. They were forced to retreat to the island of Taiwan with their nationalist forces because the communist supporters had grown so much during the war under Mao's leadership. Now, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist forces take most of China's gold reserves with them to Taiwan. But Mao and the communists are ultimately able to fill the power vacuum that was left with the defeat of Japan in China. Mao and the communists will establish in 1949 the People's Republic of China. Then Mao will work very diligently to start a dramatic transformation of Chinese society into the communist mold. Mao sees himself as the Chinese Stalin. He admired Stalin's tactics in creating a communist totalitarian regime in the Soviet Union, and ultimately he will mimic some of those same policies to ultimately industrialize China, but do so under the communist leadership and do so at a great expense, as we will see, to a great many Chinese. Now, the United States was taken off guard by the fall of China to communism under the leadership of Mao. The United States had a great number of interests, economic interests, in China prior to World War II, and after World War II, they hoped, especially with the defeat of Japan, with the U.S. forces that were still located in parts of Asia because of the rolling back of Japanese influence there, that they would be able to move in once again and continue their economic relations with parts of China. They were completely caught off guard when Mao and the communists were able to take over. The containment policy was basically having great success in Europe, containing the spread of communism. But it was not working in Asia because the United States took their eye off of Asia long enough for Mao to take over China. Now, this will create a mutual connection, anti-U.S. connection between the Soviet Union and Communist China. Beijing-Moscow partnership, if you will. Both Stalin and Mao felt threatened by the United States, and they had mutual concern over the United States policy of moving in, occupying parts of Japan after the defeat of Japan, and working diligently to rehabilitate Japan, much like we were doing in Western Germany. Because of us doing this in Japan, rebuilding Japan on the Western model, the Soviet Union and China worried about that presence so close to where they were in Eastern Europe and in Asia, and felt that the United States could use their influence in Japan, perhaps, to challenge communist dominance in their parts of the world. Now, First of all, one of the things that Stalin insisted upon is if they were going to have a mutual, I guess you would say, relationship, he insisted that Moscow, under his leadership, of course, be seen as the primary communist capital. And so ultimately we will see that Mao at Beijing will recognize the primacy of Moscow under Stalin as the communist leader of the world. And in exchange for kowtowing to Stalin being the primary communist dictator in the world, Mao will receive military and economic aid in return, which China was in great need of after the withdrawal of Japan, after the defeat of Japan. As I mentioned before, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist forces, when they retreated to the island of Taiwan, they took most of China's gold reserves with them. So China was in desperate need for economic and military aid if communism was going to survive. Making this alliance, if you will, or this relationship, solidifying this relationship with Moscow, with Stalin in the Soviet Union, was key to the success and the survivability of communism in China. After the fall of China to communism in 1949, the United States was very concerned over other areas of Asia falling prey to communist takeovers. And so our containment policy will start to shift towards Asia, to dealing with what was going on in Asia as well. After World War II was over, Korea was an area that had been occupied by Japan, and Korea will also be divided into zones of occupation. This was done right after the war was over. In 1948, there was ultimately the declaration of two Koreas. The Republic of Korea in the south was maintained or occupied by Western forces, in particular the United States, with the capital in Seoul, and there would be a democratic government that would be propped up by the West in South Korea. In North Korea, there would be the People's Democratic, quote-unquote, Republic of Korea. And Northern Korea will ultimately be maintained under a communist regime that was propped up by both Stalin and, once China falls to communism, China as well. It's important for China to make sure that Northern Korea, which they share a border with, maintains their communist government, even though the southern part was democratic. Now, ultimately, this will lead to tension between the Western forces and the communist forces within Korea itself, which will eventually flare up into, I guess you would say, one of the first hot pockets of the Cold War, the Korean War, between 1950 and 1953. What happens is North Korea, under a communist government that's being propped up by China, invades South Korea and captures the capital city of Seoul in 1950. This will cause the United States to utilize their military forces under the flag of the United Nations. They were able to push this through the United Nations, even though the Soviet Union, the threat of a veto within the Security Council by the Soviet Union was there. They were able to manipulate a way to make sure that this was a UN initiative, but the United States will supply the forces under the UN flag to move into Korea to push back the Soviet forces back to where they were prior to the invasion of South Korea. Again, this was containment. The idea being we will roll back the influence of communist North Korea back to where it was before to contain it, but not roll it back further than it was. not to push into North Korea and to liberate North Korea. So the 38th parallel was where the division line was between North and South Korea. The United States, under the UN flag, lands in Korea in 1950 and pushed back the North Koreans to the 38th parallel. The problem was the leadership of the UN forces was the United States General Douglas MacArthur, who had become very famous for his role in the war in the Pacific from World War II. And he did not want to stop at the 38th parallel where his mandate required him to stop. His mandate from the UN required him to stop. Instead, he continued to push and roll back the communist forces, and he captured the northern capital of Pyongyang. This made China sit up and take notice, and they started to push into North Korea to push back the United States past the 38th parallel, or the UN forces under the United States military. Ultimately, this will cause a great number of deaths. About 3 million were killed between 1950 and 1953, until a ceasefire was reached in the summer of 1953. Ultimately, a ceasefire was reached, but no real peace treaty was ever signed or negotiated. And we will see, to this very day, there are continued tensions in Korea between North Korea, which is still under a communist dictator, and South Korea, which is still it still has a free democratic government. This was the first hot spot in the Cold War, and the U.S. containment policy will be maintained. By the way, Douglas MacArthur was fired for going beyond his mandate, trying to free or liberate North Korea, going beyond what his orders were. But ultimately, we see still to this day tensions in this region because of the division of Korea between northern and southern. Because of the shock that the U.S. experienced when China fell to communism, and them quickly trying to defend the democracy of South Korea in the Korean War, the United States decided to extend the containment policy officially into Asia with the creation of a mutual defense pact, an Asian version of NATO called SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. The idea behind this was that the United States was concerned that if one area of Southeast Asia that had been under Western influence or democratic influence fell to a communist takeover, that it ultimately could cause the entire region to fall to communism. This was known as the domino theory. And this is what moved President Eisenhower in the 50s to consider nuclear weapon use if communism tried to spread in Southeast Asia. This also gets the United States involved in other conflicts in Southeast Asia. After the Korean War is over, we will see when there is an attempt of a communist takeover in Vietnam, northern Vietnam, under the leadership of communist leader Ho Chi Minh, invades South Vietnam. This will, of course, cause the United States to move in under the containment policy with SEATO to try to stop that. We'll discuss more in a later lecture what happens in other areas of Asia where the Cold War heats up, in particular the Vietnam War. We'll discuss that in a later lecture. Now we're going to move on to talk about what happens after the death of Stalin in 1956 between the Soviet and Chinese communists. What happens to that relationship that they had forged earlier on? Soviet-Chinese tensions are created upon the death of Khrushchev, and this is largely because the next Soviet dictator that comes to power after the death of Stalin was Khrushchev. And Khrushchev had become concerned that Soviet communism had become more about Stalin himself than about the ideology of communism. Now, Stalin had been in power for over 30 years, and it became very difficult to separate Soviet communism from the man himself, Stalin. And so Khrushchev, not wanting to bring an end to communism, mind you, in the Soviet Union, but wanting to perhaps divorce the memory of Stalin from Soviet communism, embarked upon a policy known as de-Stalinization. And when he did this, he ultimately initiated policies throughout the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe to demote the reputation or the influence of Stalin himself. Statues of Stalin were removed. The name Stalin on cities like Stalingrad was removed. Ultimately, the idea was to promote the idea of Soviet communism as an ideology, but separate from the man of Stalin. This, of course, would help to buttress Khrushchev's authority because, as we know, in a totalitarian dictatorship, a lot of it is about the cult of personality. It had become too much the cult of Stalin's personality, according to Khrushchev, and he wanted to demote that influence. Now, this made Mao angry because Mao, remember, admired Stalin. He saw himself as the Chinese Stalin, and he was willing to kowtow, if you will, to Stalin as the leader of the communist world because of the benefits that ultimately brought to China through economic and military aid. But Mao did not like Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization. This made him angry, and he thought that what Khrushchev was doing ultimately would weaken the Soviet Union. And if the Chinese communists maintained their relationship with the Soviet Union, it would weaken them as well. So what Mao does was he starts to try to separate himself. A Sino-Soviet split ultimately happens after the death of Stalin and the rise of Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. The Chinese believe that the new Soviet aid programs under Khrushchev that were given to China were too modest and had too many strings attached. So Mao himself will end the relationship with the Sino-Soviet split, and ultimately he poses himself from that point on as the real communist leader in the communist world. He continues to maintain his Stalinistic practices in China, launching the Cultural Revolution, which will ultimately industrialize China. As we know, it's still one of the industrial powerhouses in the world, but to a great price in Chinese lives. However, the division between himself and Khrushchev actually did work to the benefit of communist China, if you want to look at it as being, successful, because it still is communist, whereas the Soviet Union will eventually crumble in the late 80s and early 90s. The Chinese will also begin successful nuclear testing of their own in 1964, and this will go a long way to elevate Chinese prestige on the world stage. Mao will become the communist leader, the world's strongest communist leader by 1964 as a result of that. Now, while the United States was trying to promote the containment policy in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in our own backyard, the unthinkable happens. In the early 60s, the Cold War will come to Cuba, just to the south of the United States. A revolution will happen in Cuba, which will ultimately lead to a communist takeover. Fidel Castro Ruz, known as Castro, in the 1959 Cuban Revolution will be able to come to power, largely because the Cuban communists under Fidel Castro received massive Soviet aid from the Soviet Union under the leadership of Khrushchev. They supported the USSR's, the Soviet Union's, foreign policy in exchange for that aid. And ultimately, it will be the Cuban nationals under the communist leader, Castro, that will be able to thwart the leadership in Cuba to establish their own, quote, free Cuba, although it's not really free. It will be communist Cuba. Castro will continue to have close relations with the Soviet Union throughout the 60s, which ultimately causes great pause for the United States. This is just to the south of our nation, and since the Cold War began, we had been trying to build up our own nuclear weapons, atomic first and then nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union was doing the same thing, leading to yet another arms race. It seemed more dangerous once Cuba was taken over by someone who supported the Soviet policies. And this will eventually culminate in 1962, October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets begin assembling missiles in Cuba that are pointed directly at the United States. This is because of the goodwill that Castro had for the Soviet forces. He allows the missiles to be assembled and maintained there in Cuba, of course pointing them right at the United States in case World War III happens. The President of the United States at the time, John F. Kennedy, publicly challenged the Soviet Union when this was made known to the United States what was going on. And Cuba, as a result, was quarantined. The United States will cut off any relations with Cuba, cut off any trade relations that had gone on with Cuba before. Nobody in the United States is allowed to travel to Cuba from that point forward. And the Soviets will eventually concede. We basically threatened them, saying, okay, if you are going to maintain your missiles there, we will start firing, we will start launching missiles against the Soviet Union. This, for about 5 days or so, it looked as if World War III was right around the corner, was going to happen. The Soviet forces back down. They concede and they remove their missiles from Cuba. But the U.S. guaranteed non-interference with the Castro regime in exchange for the Soviets pulling out of Cuba. The Soviets will maintain their relationship with Cuba, but they will not be able to keep their missiles there. But the United States guaranteed that they would not try to roll back communist influence, the communist regime in Cuba as a result. We would not move in and try to force the communists out. We will maintain our quarantine on Cuba, which is still really in place to this very day. The Soviet position in the world did begin to change, or at least morph, into something different than what it had been under the policy of de-Stalinization with Nikita Khrushchev's leadership in the Soviet Union. Ultimately, this will lead to different policies being embarked upon that would be completely different from what Stalin would have done. It emboldened, first of all, experimentation by other communist leaders, especially in Eastern Europe. Some of those satellite states will start to flex their own muscles. Yes, they will still maintain themselves as communists, but they will ultimately start to act for themselves more than they had before. This ultimately will lead to some of the Soviet leadership in Russia, especially after Khrushchev, to want to allow those Eastern Bloc countries to maintain themselves a little bit more because, of course, it became increasingly expensive for the Soviet Union to maintain a presence both economically and militarily in those areas. Ultimately, this will encourage some of those communist leaders in those eastern nations to embark upon their own policies, and eventually this will lead to more tensions in those regions. Brezhnev will initiate, as the leader of the Soviet Union after the death of Khrushchev, Brezhnev will initiate a doctrine of limited sovereignty in these areas. He hoped that these Eastern Bloc countries would remain allies with the Soviet Union, but under their own communist governments, not just being propped up by the Soviet Union. He hoped that the communist governments would be maintained in those areas, since they had been living under communism for a generation by this point. Ultimately, we will see some cracks in the communist armor, however, because some of these areas, in Hungary in particular, there was an uprising among the population trying to push for a democratic government instead of the communist government that was there. And this will lead to the Soviets not wanting to allow that happen, so they will move their army in to crush that rebellion. But this shows you that later leaders in the Soviet Union, trying to maintain economic prosperity in the Soviet Union, or stability, I should say, in the Soviet Union, will agree to let go of some of those Eastern European nations, hoping that they would maintain communism. But as we will see, by the time we move into the 80s, many of those communist governments in those Eastern Bloc countries will collapse as the Soviets pull out of their support of the region. I mentioned the nuclear arms race that had begun, especially by the time we got to the 60s. This nuclear arms race that had begun between the United States and the Soviet Union. By the time we move into the later 60s and into the 70s, we need to reevaluate this arms race. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were economically feeling the pressure of a continuing buildup of their nuclear arsenals. And so eventually there will be I guess you would say, a draw when it comes to the tensions. A reduction in the hostility between the nuclear superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union will take place, and it's known as détente. This is not an end of the Cold War, but it is a suspension of the buildup of nuclear arsenals. The Cold War is costly on both sides. The Soviet Union, by the time we move into the 70s, is on the verge of economic collapse, trying to continue the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The United States is also starting to suffer some economic problems due to the costly nature of maintaining their nuclear arsenals. And so this will lead to détente, which will lead to things like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, the SALT talks, the SALT Treaty. This will also lead to the United States approaching China in a different way. Under President Nixon, China will be visited by a U.S. president and had not been visited by a U.S. president in many, many, many years, to try to negotiate some trade and opening up of economic relations between the two nations. We will also see that over time this will open up the ability of the United States and the Soviet Union to approach each other in a more open way, especially under the leadership of the United States President Reagan and the Soviet leader Gorbachev. Now, after Nixon did all this negotiating, we had the Brezhnev Doctrine and SALT and the limiting of the proliferation of nuclear arms. You would think that that would eventually lead to the end of the Cold War. But oh no! Things start to heat up once again as we move into the late 70s and early 80s. Now, one of the things that we need to note is that once Ronald Reagan came to the presidency in the United States, he will take a different approach to the USSR and once again start building up the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenals. He believed that by doing so, he could force the collapse of the Soviet Union because he recognized the economic problems that the Soviet Union was having maintaining their nuclear arsenals. And so he hoped that by the United States beginning once again the buildup of our nuclear weapons, that it would force the Soviets to either try to keep up and go economically bankrupt or be more willing to negotiate for more openness and perhaps the end of communism altogether. Ronald Reagan started referring to the USSR as the evil empire and launched and got approval through Congress for massive military spending and once again the amping up of nuclear weapons in the United States. And this forced the Soviet leader at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, to implement reforms because he could not afford, the Soviet Union could not afford to continue to proliferate their nuclear weapons. And so he tried to resolve the problem within the Soviet Union by implementing some reforms, some economic reforms to try to keep the Soviet Union from economic collapse. Ultimately, these reforms will lead to the unraveling of the USSR. This, of course, was not his intention. He ultimately wanted to maintain communism, but alter it in order to economically help to bolster the Soviet economy with his policies. But ultimately his policies will allow for revolutions to happen in Eastern and Central Europe, and ultimately one by one the Eastern Bloc countries will give up communism, and ultimately the Soviet Union also will see the collapse of communism. How does this play out? Let's look. It really begins even before Ronald Reagan comes to power and starts this reproliferation of nuclear weapons in the United States, if you think about it. It begins, or at least evidence to support what Reagan will do is clear by looking at the Soviet setbacks in Afghanistan. This shows the West, this shows the United States, that the Soviet Union is becoming weaker as we move into the late 70s and early 80s. Okay, what happened in 1979 was that there was a pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan. It was one of those regions that had been propped up by the Soviet Union. And this pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan was actually challenged, was attacked by a nationalist group, if you will, in Afghanistan known as the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were Islamic warriors who did not want communism in Afghanistan. And so what ends up happening is this initiates a 9-year battle starting in 1979. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. The pro-Soviet government that was propped up there was attacked by the Mujahideen, and this initiates this 9-year battle against the Afghani Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, since they were in opposition to communism, ultimately got support from the United States The CIA supplied the Mujahideen with ground-to-air Stinger missiles that they used against the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. And ultimately, by 1986, the Soviet Union was forced to pull out of Afghanistan. And we originally saw this as a support for nationalism in Afghanistan. Sorry, you probably just heard some thunder. There's a really bad storm going on here. Ultimately, this will lead to a power vacuum in Afghanistan. The UN negotiated a ceasefire, but this led to the full withdrawal of the Soviet forces in Afghanistan by 1989. But instead of a democratic government being fostered there, the Mujahideen will ultimately give way to the rise of the Taliban to fill the power vacuum in Afghanistan. The Taliban will take over Afghanistan, and it seems that that was made possible because the United States supported the Mujahideen against the pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan earlier on. It seems that we may have backed the wrong horse in this, but the containment policy forced us to do this. Hindsight is 20/20, of course. We had no way to know that the Taliban would ultimately be a big challenge to us later on. Once Afghanistan fell, obviously that opened up the door for more revolutions to happen against communist authority throughout Eastern and Central Europe. As I said before, there already started to be percolating a couple of rebellions or at least protests against communist authority in these regions once the Brezhnev Doctrine came through. By the time that Gorbachev comes to power and he knows that he needs to do something economically to do something different, and he can no longer afford to maintain the Warsaw Pact, to maintain the Soviet military presence in the Eastern Bloc countries. He's hopeful that those states will maintain their communist governments without Soviet presence actively there, but that is not what happens. Ultimately, this will lead to many rebellions against Soviet authority. The Polish trade union, known as the Solidarity Movement, opposed the Polish Communist Party rule, and in 1989 they start to rebel against communist authority, and ultimately Poland is freed. This will lead to basically a rolling back and unraveling of communist authority throughout the throughout the Eastern Bloc countries. Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania all follow. This is oftentimes known as the Velvet Revolution because it was a bloodless revolution for the most part in these areas. And by early 1990, Eastern Germany decided to open up the Berlin Wall, and the Soviet authority, the communist authority in Eastern Germany will also fall. East and West Germany are reunited by 1990 as a result. This is the collapse of the Soviet Union, ultimately, that we're seeing. Gorbachev initiated reforms known as perestroika, meaning restructuring, and glasnost, meaning openness. The openness part was a way for the Soviet Union to be more open with negotiations with the West to try to amp down the nuclear arms race that, of course, Reagan had stirred up again. Gorbachev recognized that economically they were not going to be able to maintain this arms race. Perestroika was the restructuring, where he hoped that the Eastern Bloc countries would maintain their own independent communist governments without the Soviet presence there. Both of these policies, he was not trying to end communism altogether. He was hoping that he could salvage the Soviet Union economically by initiating these policies, because if it continued on the economic path it was going to collapse completely. So these policies, although they were done to try to maintain the Soviet Union, to try to salvage the Soviet Union, they will ultimately open the door to a collapse of the Soviet Union. A combination of national sentiments in the Eastern Bloc countries, these long suppressed feelings of nationalism, will come to the surface. And ultimately, we see the end of communism in those areas. Several non-Russian republics will secede from the Soviet bloc by August of 1991, and more territories that had been part of the Soviet Union will be independent once again. There was an attempted hardliner takeover in Moscow as well that happened at the same time, thinking that what Gorbachev was doing was the wrong way to go, but it will fail. Ultimately, this will lead to Gorbachev maintaining his position of power, but also the Soviet Union collapses. Russia will maintain itself, and it will eventually become a new republic. But as we know, the ideas of communism do not fully go away. Still to this day, there are chilly relations between the West, meaning the United States in particular, and the former Soviet Union, as it's called, under the leadership of Putin, who had once been a member of the Communist Party, part of the KGB. We note that more chilly relationships have come about again in recent years. So it's an area we need to keep our eye on as to what's going to happen next. Thank you.